Keep in touch with the Wolf Connection Podcast on our Instagram handle at the Wolf Connection Pod, or email us your questions, comments, and guest ideas to podcast@wolfconnection.org. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection Podcast. I'm your host, John Kaufman. There's been a lot of news about a specific Mexican gray wolf that has roamed past, I guess, the boundary where most of these Mexican gray wolves go. And so this is something that was emailed to us by one of our guests. And we have two individuals here that can really dive into why this is so important, why this Mexican gray wolf is making headlines, and it's really an important conservation discussion to have. And so we're really excited to have from WildEarth Guardians. He's the Southwest Wildlife Advocate, Chris Smith, and the Deputy Director of Western Watersheds Project, Greta Anderson. Thank you both for taking the time, for being here on a four-way Zoom with us. Just how are you both doing? Chris, go with you first, and then we'll go to Greta.
I'm doing pretty well. I'm trying to find some time this week to go out near where Asha currently is in the Jemez Mountains and maybe set up some camera traps. So that's at the forefront of my mind, trying to fit in some field time in between all the Zoom meetings and emails.
What about you, Greta? How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I mean, this is a happy story right now. Asha's wandering free and wild, doing what wolves are supposed to do. So as of right now, it's a good situation, and happy about that. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And let's just dive right into it, because I know there's a lot. We'll just do quick backgrounds. Greta, we'll start with you. So Deputy Director, Western Watersheds Project, how did you come to be inside of that organization, get up to where you are, and be involved in a lot of these projects? What was your path to get there?
Well, it's a strange path, but it was herbal medicine. I came out west studying about plant medicine, and while I was out here, I realized that you couldn't conserve plant medicine without conserving the plants, and the plants were being damaged through quite a bit through public lands, livestock grazing. And so where plants could be collected or harvested, or traditional sites were being affected by this land use, this very recent cultural land use in the Southwest. So I started working to limit the effects of public lands, livestock grazing in 2004. And one of the effects of public lands, livestock grazing that's been persistent and ecosystem-wide has been the eradication of large predators on the landscape. And so that kind of led me through to wolf recovery, and recognizing that this is a way of sort of putting the landscape, all of the pieces, back onto the landscape where they belong.
Wow, that's incredible. And Chris, what about you? You've been with WildEarth Guardians for a little bit. You were the Southern Rockies Wildlife Advocate. Now you're the Southwest Wildlife Advocate. What's the path for you? How did you get there, and what was the drive to be there?
Oh, a little bit circuitous, just like Greta's. I started doing community organizing in my early 20s. Just kind of got infatuated with empowering communities that were often kind of trodden on by bigger, more powerful voices, especially stemming from industry. So I was working on rivers and salmon and forests up in the Pacific Northwest for a while, and got the opportunity to come back to my home and work on the landscapes that I grew up in, and some issues that I really care about from a personal perspective. And so, yeah, joined WildEarth Guardians in 2017. And along with the geographic move back home, it was also kind of an ideological move, in that I get to advocate for the world that I want to see, and not a compromised version of it, or kind of an integral step along the way, which I find really exciting and rejuvenating for the most part.
Yeah, it's interesting because we spoke with Lizzie Pennock just 2 weeks ago, talking about the recent legal ruling that happened for grizzly bears, and that coincided with wolf trapping. So it's great the work that you all are doing, that both of you are doing. It's just I didn't connect the dots till right now. It's like we're talking with WildEarth Guardians again. So it just seems we have a great partnership there. Just go into I guess the background about Asha and why this is so vitally important. And you spoke, Chris, about wanting to get in the field and set the camera traps and get some visuals on her. And I see the maps in your background there. Why is this such a powerful and important story, specifically in the wolf world, and I guess in conservation too, because it seems to be going across all these spectrums?
I think that Asha is a great storyteller, in short. I mean, Asha is telling a story, I think, of two things. One of which gets into kind of how we interact with the natural wild world at large. And that's that this is a wolf who has twice chosen to ignore these arbitrary policy boundaries that we think we have the power to set. And she is doing what a wolf does, which is disperse across large distances. She's going to places where wolves roamed for thousands and thousands of years before we extirpated them from these landscapes. And she's kind of shirking both convention and heavy-handed wildlife management in being wild and being free. And I think that's a really great story in and of itself. But she's also kind of telling this story about where Mexican wolves, where lobos should be and need to be in order to truly recover, and that she is going into this zone that has basically been barred for wolves by federal and state agencies for years and years. And she's saying, no, this is suitable habitat. This is where I want to be. This is where I belong. And that is kind of personifying what the best available peer-reviewed science has said for a long time, which is that we need Mexican wolves in the Southern Rocky Mountains. We need wolves in the Grand Canyon ecoregion in order for them to really recover from a scientific basis. So that's why I think Asha is important. And I'm sure Greta has supplementary thoughts as well.
Yeah, go ahead, Greta. Throw your thoughts in there too as well.
Well, Chris, I think you summed it up really nicely. And I think what's inspiring about Asha's story is her self-determination and will, and the fact that she's playing this out on a landscape where we are able to witness that. Because she has a GPS collar, we were able to see that as soon as they captured her last year and they'd moved her into captivity for a few months. And when they put her back on the landscape, she pretty much right away turned around and started going back towards northern New Mexico. Like, okay, that was kind of a weird setback. I'm going to try this one again. She's the second wolf in recent years who has done that. There was another wolf named Anubis who crossed the I-40 boundary near Flagstaff, and they picked him up and moved him back into a different part of Arizona. And he, within days, was back headed north. And, we literally, the I-40 is a roadblock because of that's the capture point for their dispersal. But for them, it's it's a challenge. It's a hazard to cross this crazy interstate, but they have a plan, and I think that wild imagination of what their plan is captures our imagination, and it can be really inspiring. It reminds us that these animals are wild, and that they have interesting lives of their own and plans for themselves. And I just think, especially when you're dealing with really social, highly intelligent creatures like wolves, you have to think, they've got something going on. And I will just say also that Asha, where she has crossed, there have been other wolves that have followed a similar pathway. There's been 8 wolves, collared wolves, that we know have crossed Interstate 40 in the past. And, they're just showing us like this is where we belong. You may have different ideas, you silly humans.
Can we get, and I think Chris just kind of mentioned it there, can we get a recap on what the press release refers to, well, one of these press releases that we'll share with everybody later refers to as I believe it's here, the policies limiting wolf dispersal to the northern parts of Arizona and New Mexico. What are these policies exactly, and how are they enforced, or how are they intended to be enforced?
Okay, so Mexican wolves were reintroduced under a specific provision of the Endangered Species Act that defines the reintroduction area. And that area is called the Mexican Wolf Experimental Population Area. And part of the agreement of this designation is that they'll be confined to a specific area. And so that boundary is at Interstate 40 in Arizona and New Mexico. That's the northern boundary. And the southern boundary is at the end of U.S. jurisdiction at the U.S.-Mexico border.
So, how do they enforce? What's the plan here for how do they stop a wolf like Asha traveling north?
They watch her collar data and then they go and catch her.
And they trap her and relocate her.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So with this letter that was written, trying to confirm support for Asha's travels through northern New Mexico, is that sort of an unprecedented ask? Like to say, hey, this is a particular individual is traveling through X, Y, and Z territory. Can we confirm safe passage for this specific individual?
I'll start, and I'm sure Greta will fill in some blanks. It's not unprecedented. I mean, groups like ours have been advocating that wolves have access to this habitat for a long time. So, the organized support of expanding this boundary and or letting wolves stay in this area is not new. But I think what's new is the number of dispersing wolves in recent years and the way that they've kind of captured the public imagination, all the while the population that they're coming from in the Gila bioregion in southwestern New Mexico and southern Arizona, the population of Mexican wolves has grown there, but the genetic crisis among those wolves is worsening. Illegal and legal killings continue. So these wolves that have traveled north, notably Asha and Anubis in recent years, they kind of they're speaking to the need to take this recovery program to the next step, I think, geographically. So that, I think, is why there's a new emphasis on telling this story and getting these wolves more room to roam, along with some changes in the kind of paradigm of Mexican wolves more broadly that we can get into later.
Yeah, it just seems, because I was reading a lot of these press releases just to get a little bit prepped, and it does seem that there more leeway, Greta or Chris, in these agencies obviously allowing, or there seems to be less of an inclination to immediately go and get Asha and trap her. I could be wrong, but it seems as though because of the public outpouring of support, because of all the conservation groups that are there's a little bit of a hesitancy to just do the status quo, which is to go, like you say, track the GPS data, trap, and relocate back. Is there a little bit of hesitancy there, or is it basically going as like what happened with Anubis?
Well, I would like to think so. I would like to think that the agencies are recognizing the folly of trying to confine a wild animal to a line on a map that she can't see. I would like to think that they would recognize that she's really determined. I think that there's some other factors working in her favor. One is that she's stayed pretty out of sight and out of conflict. And so there isn't any reason really that people would be wanting her to be removed. I think it looks just sort of, heavy-handed management to go get an animal that's just being an animal and not having any problems. It looks a little silly. And so hopefully the agencies are thinking that way. What we do know is that science has said that this population needs an expanded area. Until last July, actually, the Endangered Species Act provision that allows for endangered species reintroductions was limited to reintroductions within the historic range of the species. And that rule was rewritten, not the specific rule pertaining to Asha and Mexican wolves, but there is leeway now within the agencies in general, within the legal framework, to allow wolves out or reintroductions outside of their historic space. So there's kind of a little bit of gray area that didn't exist previously that they could be relying on. And I really think that public support is helpful, if not for Asha's, persistent freedom, but for the need to revise the recovery plan and the 10J rule to incorporate this expanded boundary in the long run. Like Asha's basically a symbol of what needs to be changed for all of the wolves for the entire program.
And of course, we don't know the answer to this, but she's gone up there. She's traveled in that direction. I think I read multiple times as of a few days ago. She was either heading back up there or was up there again. Is there any theory on, I'm sure there are plenty of theories, but are there any accepted theories? Are there any strong theories on why she started roaming to an unusual area in the first place and why she continues to attempt it?
So wolves dispersal in wolves is a natural drive, and it ensures that they won't mate with other wolves who are too closely related. So it's this like cool sort of instinct of hers to go find wolves that she's not related to. And unfortunately, the Mexican wolves in the wild right now are on average as related to each other as siblings. There's not a lot of genetic diversity in the population. So has hardwired into her a message that she needs to go find some new people to hang out with. And, unfortunately, we haven't given her the new people up there yet. We need to help her find her people by populating that area, that landscape with wolves.
Chris, for you as the Southwest wildlife advocate, what does this mean because it seems like this is your jurisdiction, this is your backyard of advocacy in a way. How is this just personally for you to be looking at this and fighting for this and being on the front line of conservation in this arena just in general?
From like a very personal perspective, I remember when I was a kid and one of my brothers-in-law was volunteering for what is now WildEarth Guardians on, wolf recovery. And he came from like a Hispanic ranching family, basically, but he believed that wolves should return to these landscapes many, many years ago. He's a little older than me. And so to have wolves, or a wolf at least, kind of in that area where he was advocating for wolves to be 30 years ago is like personally gratifying. But from my perspective as my jurisdiction over the Southwest, this is kind of, there's two final pieces to the puzzle in terms of rewilding the American Southwest from a wolf perspective. And one is the imminent release of wolves in Colorado in the next week or two, presumably. And the other is recovering this Mexican wolf population and, getting basically a continuum of wolves from the Arctic Circle down into Mexico, like it used to be a couple hundred years ago. So these are puzzle pieces that are falling into place slowly. There's a lot of bureaucratic and political obstacles to them, but this is rewilding. This is, relearning how to live with things that are perceived as inconvenient or scary or distasteful, and in doing so, kind of evolving as a human society. So, when we get that continuum of wolves back on the landscape in an ecologically relevant way, that's a lot of what I'm working towards. So that'll be a major success for groups like WildEarth Guardians, but also for people who have done a lot of historic wrongs in the last few hundred years and slowly starting to right them.
And so another quote in the press release is Asha showing us that there is good habitat north of Interstate 40. What kind of research is collected first off on her specific travels? How accurate and specific is it to her route and to maybe whether she's successfully hunting and all of these things? But how does one observe, say, that, like you mentioned, obviously genetics is a pretty good driver for these types of travels, but how does one observe that she's not, I mean, she's not roaming in search of habitat or a mate, but she's actually found suitable habitat.
Yeah, the Valles Caldera is an incredible place. There's abundant elk and other wildlife. She's in a really good spot. The habitat of northern New Mexico is eminently suitable. One thing to keep in mind is that most of wolf habitat is grazed by public lands livestock grazing, and every cow you see out there is displacing a native ungulate. So the cow's eating the food that would otherwise be going to elk or deer or antelope. And so wolves, eat what's out there. And if it happens to be a domestic cow, they get in trouble. Fortunately, the Valles Caldera doesn't have, I think it has one permitted livestock operation. But at this time of year, there's also, going to be abundant wildlife on the Santa Fe National Forest, fewer cows, fewer people, and it's a great place probably to be a wolf right now.
I know we're kind of bouncing back and forth, but I know we talked about the habitat and the need for there to be more habitat, and to extend these imaginary lines. Obviously, that none of these animals, you look at Yellowstone, and this is a perfect example of like, well, they're going outside the park boundary. They don't know that there's not a park boundary. There's trees and stuff, and they go there. Have there been policy discussions, policy talks because of what Asha's doing? Has it reopened any of these conversations about expanding those borders, expanding the boundaries? Chris, as you were saying, connecting once Colorado gets those first wolves introduced, probably over the next, 2 to 3 years when there's an actual stable population, connecting this whole corridor again. Is there policy that's open, or is it still just more in the side conversation? We're still going to play everything as is at this moment and just sort of see how this plays out?
Yeah, there haven't been any formal discussions about changing or opening that policy that I'm aware of from, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the wildlife agencies of New Mexico or Arizona. But I know that Asha's travels have kind of rekindled a lot of informal conversations among land management folks, among NGO folks, among scientists. So, formally, we're still knocking on the door outside, but some folks have, kind of opened the window of that door to talk to us about what we think. And, my hope is that Asha is the one who opens that door again, and allows for a real, robust, science-based, values-based conversation to have about what these wolves need next in order to recover. So maybe Greta can add to that.
Yeah, I would say, one really interesting opportunity for Asha is that both the recovery plan and the 10J rule that was written in 2022 are in litigation. And so a court may find that the service has done recovery of Mexican wolves an injustice, and we believe that they will, by arbitrarily binding them to this geographic landscape. A court may say, hey, you guys have to go back to the drawing board and revisit this analysis and this plan. And then there's a great opportunity for them to do it the right way and in accordance with the science.
It really just seems too, Greta, because we've had these conversations about Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, a lot of these states and these territories seem to be in these litigations more and more, especially when we talk about the Rocky Mountain West, we talk about Montana and Idaho most of the time, Wyoming to a degree now. Do you believe that all of these things are going to come a tipping point where there is going to be some federal intervention? Just in your opinion, I don't know if there's any solid thing behind it, but it really just seems that the policies that a lot of these Western states, and now we're getting into Mexican gray wolves, and to think that they can be confined to this area is just kind of baffling when you look at it. And Asha in a couple of days just is like, all right, peace out. I'm going, north of I-40. I kind of mentioned to Chris, but do you see this as a rumbling of the wildlife sort of taking back their land on a natural basin, saying, hey, we can't be confined to this stuff anymore, and it's kind of time for humans to catch up?
I think what's happening on our planet right now is it's kind of a make or break moment. And we're dealing with a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis that are, proceeding apace next to each other. And I think that wolves are a symbol of a larger story of how much we are committed to sharing the planet with non-human inhabitants, and more people are realizing that's an absolutely critical part to sharing the planet with human inhabitants as well, right? We're all in this together, and I think wolves are kind of they're super politicized and they're fought over, and they're a real hot button issue. But I think ultimately they're emblematic of this kind of make or break moment for the future of life on Earth.
Greta, you were mentioning the importance of this topic of cattle grazing just now, and also in your beginning statement, in this conversation about red wolves and the effort to reduce the impact of wild grazing. Are there ways to reduce impact, or is it really a matter of trying to reduce the practice in general? In other words, can you reduce impact in other ways than simply reducing the number of wild grazing cattle?
So, there's a lot of people who talk about coexistence measures, ways of preventing conflict with wolves, with livestock. Unfortunately, livestock have conflict with a lot of things. They have conflict with soil stability and vegetation communities. They spread invasive species. They suppress, riparian habitats. For the sake of recovering wolves in the very near term, it's important that we practice coexistence and limit the conflicts that are causing the death of wolves. Right. In the long term, we have to kind of take into account how much landscape level degradation for all species are we willing to tolerate for this very kind of limited land use. Only 2% of all of the beef in the United States is raised on Western public lands. So it's really, but it's a huge amount of habitat. It's a great opportunity for rewilding. And so, yes, there are better ways to do public lands livestock grazing. Are there any good ways to do it when it comes with this whole suite of ecologically devastating effects? It's an open question.
Chris, what's the way to, because there's so many, and the press releases and all the information you sent us is outstanding. Thank you so much for forwarding that to us. And just before we got to this podcast, what's the best way that you at WildEarth Guardians are able to give this information out to the public? Because there's so much. Well, Asha is such a great story, and that's just like a piece of what this is all about. What's your tactic when you go out there, when you're talking to people, when you're engaging individuals or groups about this story? What are the things you try to hit on so that they really get the meat and potatoes of what this really means?
Oh, that's a tough question, but a good one. And just before I answer it all, I'm gonna kind of pull back the curtain. Greta and I are both getting messages that Asha may be being captured
right now.
So,
wow.
Just to.
Sorry, so I'm like watching my text thread. Like,
we just got two different sources from. So, anyway, I'll try to answer the question regardless. So, first and foremost, Asha is an incredible messenger in terms of raising public awareness. This is the world I live in, the world of wolves and bears and beavers and all things like that. But a lot of people don't live in this world. And I talk to a lot of people who live in New Mexico or live in the Southwest, and they don't have a clue that there are wolves down here. So Asha she's basically the best conversation starter to broach that topic and educate people that, we've wiped out a lot of things, but we're still working on bringing some of them back. And so in that way, she's an amazing party guest. But, in advocating for her to remain free and wild, we have the opportunity to bring a lot of new voices who I think historically haven't been interested in or haven't been included in some of these conversations about, what the landscapes of northern New Mexico should look like, what wolf recovery should look like. And I think, Asha's journey combined with what's happening in Colorado right now is just, it's created, I think for better and worse, a huge interest in wolves in a region that, wolves have been in the Southwest for 25 years now, reintroduced in the Southwest, but it creates a newfound interest and a newfound way of talking about these animals. And as Greta said, we get to have that conversation over a backdrop of, what are we doing in a very broad way? How are we treating these lands? How are we treating each other? What stories are we prioritizing? What's the future we want to have? So again, it sounds overly simple and I keep returning to it, but Asha is just an incredible way to start having those conversations. And then, hopefully Asha plays a role in changing policy, changing laws down the line. But for now, she's part of this discussion. And there's also a moose that's been wandering around in northern New Mexico who also, like Asha, came down from Colorado in January, and they were occupying similar territory in January. And now they're occupying kind of miraculously similar territory now here in December. And, the moose has its own biological, ecological, legal paradigm that I won't get into. But I think, the moose has 20,000 Facebook followers. People are interested in the wild, and they're interested in these individuals, and they're interested in what, life outside of humanity does, maybe more than we have been before. So again, she's creating a moment.
I mean, the moments, and like you said, and thank you for being genuine, both of you, with that information you dropped before that answer. I mean, I go back to this too, and this could be for either one of you, whoever feels called to answer it. With the capturing and then relocating back into these territories, it just seems to me there's, like I said, I think I brought up before about the tipping point, but animals are going to animal, I guess is the best way to put it. They're going to roam. There are really no boundaries. And it seems as though, like I said before, that there's coming to a point where we have to understand that even with there's ill intention, good intention in both of these scenarios, right? And whatever way it's going to be, the wolf or the moose or whatever it's going to be is going to do what it's going to do to survive and thrive. And I just always wonder, the more conversations we have here, when will humanity take the biggest step back that they could to just let this be natural? And it's not really a question. It's just a thought that keeps pervading through my head when we have this, when we talk about, wolves being lured out of Colorado into Wyoming so they can be shot. And it's just, what's the end game for all of this stuff? And for Asha to be roaming the way she's roaming and to push the boundary, which we as humans have done since time immemorial, why not let the wolf, why not let these animals do these things? I don't know. It was just a thought that was going through my head a little bit. I don't know if it was to tag off of that. Yeah.
Well, no, I think that's really, that kind of thing goes through my head all the time. It's like, when are we going to stop with the dominion over all things mentality and learn to live with our, the other neighbors on this planet? When are we going to stop having to control everything, recognizing, that this command and control approach to wildlife and wildlands has really got us in some pretty rough shape, whether it's, huge fires or massive flooding or whatever. We're not able to control the forces of nature, and trying to control it has only made things worse. And so what we need to do is figure out how to, accept and get along with these wild lives and wild ways. I think Asha is a great messenger. And one of the things that they keep saying about Asha is, the reason that they pulled her back last year and then they put her in captivity with a mate to try to pair her up. And if they do that this year, it will be a similar probably scenario of saying they need to boost the recovery program by having her mate and have offspring. And that's looking at wolf recovery from a very strictly numbers, mathematical equation, right? Of like, she can produce X, Y, or Z number of offspring, and that's important. But what she's doing right now is so important. She's doing something really important if we could just learn from that instead of trying to force her to succeed on our terms, which is, unfortunately, strictly a numbers game at this point in the program.
Mm.
Yeah, Asha's story only ends this way, probably. It's just a matter of when. So, or this chapter of her story, let's put it that way, because she'll probably run again. But what I was going to say, and you all were discussing this on your recent podcast with Lizzie, I think, and I forget the exact language you used, but you were talking about kind of a need for humility, and specifically you were talking about recreating in grizzly country and the need to be aware that you're not the biggest fish in the pond in every pond, and along those lines, I mean, I think we need to examine, and this goes well beyond wolves, but I think wolves are a great test case for this. Like, we need to examine how important we really are. I think everyone goes through the world, both as individuals and as groups, acting as though, my well-being and my interests are the most important. And that doesn't end well, I don't think, for individuals or groups or species for that matter. And so, yeah, I just feel like, along with relinquishing this control and adopting a healthy fear, like you all were discussing, we really have to examine like what role we want to have on this planet as a species moving forward. And I know that that's a rather large topic, but it's always at the forefront of my mind when I'm thinking about wildlife, because this is something that we have metaphorically often and sometimes literally put under the heel of our boots, because we can. And I think that speaks pretty poorly about us. And I think the challenge is changing that narrative and changing the way we basically behave as a group of people.
I think one thing that's so interesting too about wolves in particular is they gave us dogs, right? Like, we formed a relationship with wolves that was mutually beneficial thousands of years ago, and like live with these animals like they're our family. And the disconnect to be able to still see wolves as some kind of other that is less deserving of our compassion it really is amazing to me. There are familiars in so many ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just about the news that we may have just gotten about Asha's journey and possibly it coming to a temporary end. I just want to know how you guys are feeling about it, really. And we'll start with Chris.
Yeah, I don't know if you all have done breaking news on a podcast before, but
no, I don't think so.
It's kind
not
of
this breaking. Not this.
It's serendipitous, maybe. Yeah, my first reaction is disappointment, even knowing that this is the likely inevitable end to this chapter in Asha's story. To see this, again, I called it heavy-handed management. You can call it all kinds of things. To see this need for wildlife agencies and people to put other animals where we think they belong is just a really disappointing thing to see repeated over and over, even as we claim to progress and learn. So yeah, I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed in decision makers who feel the need to flex their muscle and who feel the need to spend thousands of dollars to fly helicopters around and shoot tranquilizer darts at wolves for what reason I don't know, aside from exhibiting that level of control. And also I'm kind of relishing and hoping the next wolf, whether that's Asha or someone else, their journey north of Interstate 40, and watching these agencies have to continually balance their need to control with the inevitability of wildness being wild, because as frustrating as it is to watch, I think that's part of what's going to need to happen in order to make real policy changes and in order to restore Mexican wolves.
I mean, when you look at this stuff on its face, and that's a great point too. I think about the cost. I mean, I think these are things that maybe the general public, hopefully, the more they listen to people such as yourselves, Greta and Chris and Stephen and I, when we talk about the monetary costs on this podcast, about what it actually takes to have management, to, like you say, to fly a helicopter, to dart, to trap, to bring the animal back. And then ultimately, we always do these things. I mean, we do it at the sanctuary all the time, right? We push in sort of like, groundhog holes, and we're like, all right, we're just going to fill this hole in. Well, that animal's just going to dig that hole in 2 seconds. It's just not going to matter. Or a wolf, we punch in and we're like, this is a little bit dangerous. And they're like, well, we're going to dig it again. So I just wonder when that's all going to come to a realization. Maybe, Greta, you have a little bit more insight. Is the money issue ever a discussion that people are aware of in terms of the amount of money that actually goes into the management of, and we can just stick with Mexican gray wolves for the moment, but I think overall in general with wildlife conservation, are people aware of the amount of money that goes into these things, and to see, well, my tax dollars are being used to keep a wild animal from not being wild, and I don't think that's a great way for my money to be spent. Do those conversations ever come up? Is that something that you ever encounter? And Chris, if you want to tag on the back of this, if you have any information too, that'd be great. And Greta, we'll start with you.
Conversations that I would prefer to have are about how our tax dollars are being spent to prevent wildness from taking over, and a supporting industry that's destroying ecological health. The cost of wildlife management is incidental to these other land uses that we've de facto or tacitly agreed to. So the reason why they're moving wolves is because the public lands livestock industry doesn't want them. The reason why we're restocking fish is because industry has dried up the streams. Those are the things that are expensive. It's not the wildlife restoration or recovery that's expensive. And so I feel like that the conversation around like, oh, well, every wolf on the landscape is worth $20,000 because there's X number of wolves and it's X number of dollars isn't fair, because that's actually intangible. What we know is that amount of money has to be spent because of the degradation that we've allowed to occur somewhere else, which has surely profited private interest somewhere else, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the thing that I think about is it doesn't cost too much to save wildlife. It's cost us everything to endanger them.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. The only thing I would add, and it's just kind of building on what Greta said, is, a lot of times the word conservation is used in this proactive context, like we're doing conservation, X stakeholders are paying for conservation. And, I think the only proactive conservation is like habitat restoration, being on the ground, planting trees, pulling invasives, putting large woody debris in streams. That's proactive conservation. I think when we use conservation in a policy way, which is how it's often used, it's totally backwards, because the best thing we could do to quote unquote conserve or recover species or biodiversity or landscapes is just get the heck out of the way and not do anything. And so this need to do and to say we're conserving is, I think it's a misnomer, and it's not an accidental one. It's one that has been carefully crafted by certain stakeholders and industries over the years. But yeah, this notion that we have to pay for wolf recovery, or we have to pay for the species or whatever. I mean, the amount we pay to limit and suppress, and in some cases exterminate species dwarfs all the money that's ever been spent towards recovering species or conserving landscapes. And yeah, again, it just gets back to this idea is like, what kind of role do we need to have, and how big should it be? And I think, the simplest answer is like, the less we do as a society, like the more rewilding will take place. It's not like we're instigating that. It happens without us. All we do is limit it and suppress it for the most part, except for those few examples.
I want to ask you both, just have two more things for both of you. And again, we can't appreciate your time enough and the information you all are giving us. What do you see? I'll start with Greta first. What's the future look like for Mexican gray wolves? I mean, it's clear they had, like you said, the numbers ballooned. I think they got to around 250, but there's caveats with the numbers part of it and the genetic diversity. Personal opinion, where do we stand with recovery? I know there's a lot of work to be done, but if you were to look ahead, where do you think this species sits as we move into the future?
Well, best case scenario, pragmatically speaking, is the court rules and tells Fish and Wildlife Service, no, you're supposed to follow the best available science according to the Endangered Species Act. Go back and do this again. And they are forced to reckon with the changes that must be made to recover the species. That's my pragmatic view. Best case scenario. Best case scenario, like pie in the sky, is that some of the decision makers in this current presidential administration recognize that they hold the key to change, the future of wolf recovery in the West by doing the right thing without the court ordering them. And they go ahead and they put the wheels in motion to save wolves, across the West. Right.
What about you, Chris?
Yeah, I think, like I said earlier, Asha is creating a moment, but that's kind of a microcosmic moment. And we're really at a bigger moment. And the reason for that is the Colorado reintroductions, which are going to interface with Mexican wolf recovery from a legal perspective, from a genetic perspective. And they're basically, the proposal right now is to have this bizarre, nonsensical, extremely costly no wolf zone between Interstate 40 and the Colorado-New Mexico border, which is like a crazy thing to think about. And the other part of the moment is that the recovery efforts in Mexico, where both state and federal agencies have long touted as, the place where a lot of this recovery has to happen, those efforts have stalled out, and most Mexican wolves have been killed recently. There's maybe 15 out there right now, and there's no collared ones. So we're at this real moment where it's kind of a pincer movement from the south, in that there's not a viable population of Mexican wolves there, and then there's this population of northern wolves coming into Colorado. So we're at decision time for the survival of this species. And I think the next year or two is going to be really important. So where we are is on a precipice, I think. And like Greta said, I think what we need to see to have these wolves recovered is we need, as soon as possible, subpopulations in the Southern Rocky Mountains, whether that's in Southern Colorado or Northern New Mexico, and then one in the Grand Canyon ecoregion. And for those three populations, two new ones and one existing one, to be connected by dispersing wolves like Asha in order to, genetically and numerically recover the species. And that can happen. I mean, there's no rock that is too big to move for these agencies to make that happen. It's a political unwillingness. And if they, got rid of that fear or whatever it is that's motivating them to kind of put the roadblocks on recovery, it could happen really easily and really quickly. And I think wolves show us that. But we need more bravery and courage among decision makers for that to happen.
I mean, extremely well said. My last question for both of you. We'll go Greta first. When you hear the word wolf, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
Well, I think of lupins, which is a flower. Go figure.
What about you, Chris?
I mentioned this earlier, but wolves to me are the great test. Like, can we have the humility and perspective to exist on this planet with things that can be a little bit difficult to exist with? And I think if the answer is yes, that speaks really highly of us as a society. And if the answer turns out to be no, I don't think we stand a chance with the other challenges we're going to face. So yeah, wolves are the best test, I think.
Love that. Greta Anderson, Chris Smith, thank you both for what you continue to do, what you guys are doing on the front lines here with Asha, with everything. It's, Asha literally is the linchpin for a lot of these things. Thank you all for your time. Really appreciate it. Just stick around for a moment while we sign off. How's to you all out there? And Stephen, I'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.